Hello, everyone. I'm just giving it another minute or so for people to join us. Welcome to those of you who are already here. All right, let's get started. I am Dana Ricci, the Director of Alumni Relations and Engagement for the School of Arts and Sciences. I would like to welcome you to today's virtual Scarlet Speakers series. I appreciate everyone's understanding for the reschedule of this event, and I appreciate David's availability to join us today. As a reminder, we've muted everyone's microphones and your cameras are turned off. So we ask that you use the Q&A feature to submit any questions you may have during the presentation. We'll come to the questions as soon as the presentation's done. If there's any need for you to give us a little bit more background, we'll be able to unmute you so that you can speak with David directly. This event is also going to be recorded. So if you know anybody who might enjoy it that couldn't attend today, you'll have the link and you can send it along to them. Additionally, as a reminder, these events are not just for Rutgers alums. So if you ever get an invitation to something and you think someone outside of Rutgers might enjoy, by all means, please forward the invitation over to them. So now I would like to welcome today's speaker, David Alexander. David is a Rutgers Graduate School of Education graduate. After high school, he served in the U.S. Army, including almost all of 1970 in Vietnam. He majored in Spanish as an undergraduate and then spent 2 years in a church-related job in Taiwan. After receiving a master's degree from the New Brunswick Theological Seminary in 1980, he crossed the street and did his Master's of Education at Rutgers Graduate School of Education. He returned to Taiwan to church occupations for the next 37 years. While doing historical research in the seminary and university archives in 2008, he found a hero, John Talmadge, who graduated from Rutgers College in 1842 and the seminary 3 years later. Talmadge had spent his career in, oh man, David, I'm going to probably say this wrong. Xiamen, yeah. China. Thank you. Today's presentation will focus on stories and illustrations from university and seminary archives dealing with the years prior to 1857, when what was quaintly called Our Church College in New Jersey became New Jersey's premier research university. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker, David Alexander.
Thank you very much. Before I start with what's on your screen, I'd like to make some corrections in the information I gave for the introduction, and that was that Rutgers became the state university in 1864 to 1867, sometime in that period. I was off by 10 years when I wrote the introduction material. And even again, before I start, I want to tell you a story I just learned a couple days ago. It comes from a man I met last year who lives here in Michigan in the same town where I do. He was the development officer at New Brunswick Theological Seminary for 6 years in the 1990s. And during that time, he lived in a house on College Avenue between Seminary and Bishop Streets, Seminary Place and Bishop Street in the heart of the College Avenue campus. His daughter was in high school at that time. And so he thought, well, she ought to have one of these campus tours just to get used to it, because before she chooses a college or a university, she's got to go on a tour. So we're here in the middle of Rutgers, let's just sign up for a tour. He didn't say anything to the student guide who was appointed, but halfway through the tour, he sort of nodded in the direction of the theological seminary and he asked the student, "What's that?" To which the student responded, "That's the Rutgers State Seminary," which is the reason why we're having this topic today. What is a private religious school doing smack in the middle of Rutgers, the New Jersey's state university? First, I'll tell you a bit about myself. I am from Los Angeles, born and raised there. After Army and college, I went to Taiwan on a short-term 2-year church assignment with the Reformed Church, which is New Brunswick Seminary. And then I returned to the US, did a master's degree at New Brunswick and a master's degree at Rutgers, and went back to Taiwan, which is the central part of my life. 39 years total in Taiwan. before I retired 3 years ago and came here to Michigan, where my wife is from. And that's me. So now in retirement, I think back on some of these things, and I'm taking advantage. I'm pleased that the School of Arts and Sciences has given me this chance to do some research and learn some stuff. I have to give credit to Dr. John Coakley, retired emeritus professor of church history at New Brunswick Seminary, because his article, there's a URL at the bottom of the screen there, published based on an address he gave to the retired faculty of Robert Wood Johnson Medical School in 2015. I have mercilessly cribbed from his work, and I'm almost hoping, I can't see your faces, I'm hoping one of them is not Dr. Coakley, because he's probably cringing as he listens to me mess this all up. Divinity schools in the middle of or adjacent to large universities, it's not a rare thing.
I'm sorry, David.
Yes?
I just want to interrupt here. I'm sorry, Steve DeFeo, just doing some tech support. If you could just go backwards on your presentation and forwards one more time, I think we're going to need to do that for showing some of these images.
Okay. You have Dr. Coakley?
Yes, sir.
Do you have this big picture full screen?
Yes, sir. So we'll just go with the implementation.
Okay, and I'll do
we
the
talked
double
about
click.
earlier.
I'll do the double click from now on.
Thank you.
Divinity schools in the middle of or adjacent to large universities are not rare. Harvard has Harvard Divinity, Yale Divinity. Princeton has Princeton Theological Seminary right next door. Emory University, Vanderbilt University, the University of Chicago, and that's this picture. In the left corner is the chapel of the University of Chicago Divinity School. Let's see, any place named Loyola, and even a minor university like Calvin University, 30 miles from where I'm living, or Biola University in Orange County, California, or even Azusa Pacific University, where I got my undergrad degree in Spanish, opened a school of theology sometime 25 years ago or so. But those universities are all private. And Rutgers, come on now, the State University of New Jersey. So what is a divinity school doing here? So to get there, we have to go back. But before we go all the way back, I want to tell you where we're headed. In the 19th century, New Brunswick Theological Seminary saved Rutgers. And in the 21st century, Rutgers returned the favor. If we look at the College Avenue campus, there's a smiley face right there in the middle, and that's where New Brunswick Theological Seminary and Gardner Sage Library are now, and the parking lot over against Bishop Place. That's the seminary, that bit of land.
I'm sorry, David, one more time. I just
one more time back and forward. Got it now?
No, sir. We are still looking at the arc of the story on our screen.
Okay. Back, forward.
Yes, sir. We're good
Okay.
now. I'm sorry for the interruptions.
No, please interrupt. The stories will be useless without the pictures. The seminary wasn't always there. In fact, it began across the river in Manhattan, and its roots claimed as 1784, the oldest theological seminary, independent theological seminary in the United States, although that has an argument between New Brunswick and Andover Newton, but Andover Newton moved out of Boston a few years ago and now is part of Yale. So New Brunswick still is having its own campus. Let's see. Moved to New Brunswick in 1810 after the opening of Old Queens, our beloved building at Rutgers. In 1813, in fact, the seminary was the larger school. The theological institution, as it was called then, and the literary institution, as was the college then, lived side by side in Old Queens. Why were they there? Another map. Tell me when it shows. Back, forward. We got a map?
We still have the same map.
Okay, back and forward again.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
It's the 17th century Dutch North America?
Right.
Yes, sir.
Dutch New Netherlands with the red dot approximating where New Brunswick is. Even after the English took over late in the 17th century, Dutch North America was still a Dutch-speaking place. New Paltz, New York was French-speaking. There were French Huguenots, but because the English and French were in a war between empires then, the English took over, and whereas it was okay to be a French-speaking bunch in the Dutch colony, it wasn't in the English colony. So the French were told, you can't have French anymore for your churches and your how you run your town. So the French decided, we'll learn Dutch instead. So the New Paltz Church, which is still there today, had been a French-speaking church, and in the 17th century became a Dutch-speaking church, and in the 18th or 19th switched to English. The Dutch had their own churches all through this area, and there was people spoke Dutch. Sojourner Truth grew up here. She spoke Dutch before she spoke English. But as more and more of the population became American-born, there was less and less of a connection through which young men from this colony would go back home to the old country to get trained for ministry, especially the graduate level education that was required by Presbyterians and Dutch Reformed back then. Presbyterians took care of it with Princeton. The Dutch Reformed did some agitating to get their own training. But we have to go to Queens College even before that happened. Have we got the chapel window now?
No, sir. We have
the chapel
century Dutch. Go back to one more.
1766 Queens College in New Brunswick. The window in Kirkpatrick Chapel.
Not yet.
Let's try it again.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay. Queens College was chartered in 1766, and it was chartered, got a royal charter given to these Dutch people to have a college, an undergraduate college, to train their young men for church leadership at the high school level, which became Rutgers Prep, and the college level, which was Queens College. After which the best of the college graduates, those with their most pious and most time and money and inclination and calling, would go to the Netherlands to be finished up with graduate level ministerial training. The board of trustees was made up of churchmen, and they hired clergymen to be the presidents of the college, but they didn't provide much money. And ministers going to the old country when you'd grown up in the new country finally became unpopular. So, next picture.
Just try to flip back and forth between it. Maybe one more time.
I'll start talking, maybe it'll come up.
There we go.
Okay. And eventually the churches in the Mohawk Valley, from Mohawk Valley to Philadelphia, got tired of sending their people overseas. So they agitated for localizing the training for the ministry on this side of the Atlantic. And in 1768, finally, the church in the Netherlands relented and said, you can do it over there. But they needed a professor for a while, for 15 years, in fact, while they looked for a professor and got things together. They allowed local clergy to train up young men who were college graduates to become ministers. But that was partly because of the Revolutionary War, partly because of all kinds of things. And eventually, in 1784, they found John Henry Livingston, who'd been born in Poughkeepsie, of English ancestry, but Poughkeepsie was up in that Dutch part of the Hudson Valley. He graduated from Yale in 1762 and headed off to the Netherlands, where he spent 8 years getting his ministerial training and then doctoral training. And he returned to New York in 1770, where he became minister of the Collegiate Church. Now, Livingston, we cannot pretend that he's totally noble. In 1778, he inherited a sugar plantation in Jamaica from his father-in-law, which had 200 slaves. So Livingston was a slave owner for 6 years. In 1784, he sold the plantation and the slaves, but his legacy is tainted. The church's legacy is tainted, and Rutgers' legacy is tainted through this connection. Back to this one now. Manhattan, 1784 to 1810. I'll give it 2 more clicks to get it.
You're good. You were set
Okay.
there.
In 1784, Livingston was in Manhattan, and he was appointed a professor in the church, which is 4 offices: deacon, elder, minister, and professor. He was a professor. He could train ministers. He began offering instruction in his home to ministerial candidates. He was down in South Manhattan at the Collegiate Church. For a while, they tried to start a theological seminary far, far away in Brooklyn, but that failed. And then, let's see, the training he gave was overseen by a group not called the Board of Trustees, but by the superintendents. And so he had to report to somebody for what he was training people at. I'm going to go aside for a minute here and say that the Collegiate Church, of which he was the pastor, still exists today. In fact, it is the oldest corporation chartered in the state of New York. It's been around since 1628. Continues to operate as 4 churches, one in Fort Washington, one in the West End, one in Greenwich Village, and then what's called Marble Collegiate Church at the foot of Fifth Avenue. There was another church. There was another one someplace up Midtown, and then on the corner of what is Rockefeller Center, St. Nicholas Reformed Collegiate Church was there until 1949. So it was all over Manhattan. It still exists today. The Board of Superintendents for Theological Education, though, saw in Livingston not only somebody with the right degree and office in the church, but they saw in him and the church he represented a source of funding for their project. Change of slides. Theological education moves to New Jersey. Got it?
We have New York City still, so if you just want to flip back and forth.
It should be
I
a
think
picture.
we're a little bit ahead of the game now. We're at one more.
We got theological education moves to New Jersey, 1810.
No, sir. We're at one before that. We're at theological education in New York right now.
Okay, we have to go one more.
Perfect.
Okay. As the 18th century turned to the 19th, over by the Raritan, things weren't going so well. The college had been chartered in 1766, but by 1793, it had to suspend its operation. The trustees continued meeting after the college was suspended, but they couldn't come up with enough money to fund the thing. And that was an embarrassment to the church, which had no place of their own to send their own men. Those young men intending for ministry were doing their undergraduate work among other kinds of people at places like King's College in New York City, Yale, Union College, Harvard, Union College in Schenectady, and Harvard. And then somebody, though this somebody was probably not on the Board of Superintendents, more likely sounds like somebody from the Board of Trustees of the college, realized there was money and a professor over there doing a theology work in Manhattan. And so they raised up money to build a building. You can do that. You can get money for a building, but you can't get money for continuing operations. And they called Livingston to come, and they built Old Queens. So Livingston came over in 1810 and started to teach. In one half of Old Queens, he was making ministers. On the other side of the building, he was making gentlemen. And the gentlemen came from across the street, Rutgers Prep. But it wasn't Rutgers Prep yet. It was just sort of the grammar school. The grammar school, the college, and the theological institution. Now we should have a picture of Old Queens.
Yes, sir.
Livingston complained about the bad conditions he faced in New Brunswick. He was from the city. He was an urban creature. Oh, he enjoyed rural vacations in Flushing, Queens, but he was an urban creature, and New Brunswick was far too rural. He regarded it, in one letter, he wrote about it as sort of like a fetid swamp. He was the college president, okay. He was the professor of theology, and he was the entire entire operations main fundraiser. After the outlay for construction, as I said earlier, the church provided very little continuing operation fund. Jump forward 100 and many years. Howard Hageman was president of New Brunswick Seminary when I was there in 1979 and 80. He once commented, a former theological president's tombstone reads, "The beggar died." And that was Livingston's condition too. So two stories hang from this situation. The first happened around 1813. The college had recently reopened, but was struggling. There was a single man, a clergyman named Elias van Bunschoten, whom Livingston had known because they'd both grown up in Dutchess County, New York. Van Bunschoten studied at Princeton, then got his ministerial education after 1768 from local clergymen up and down the Hudson. And he was ordained and began working in the Delaware Valley up around Port Jervis, New York. In 1784, he was appointed by the church as a trustee of Queens College. But Van Bunschoten was not just a single clergyman, he was also a contentious man. He was often in conflict with the church because the local churches weren't paying his salary, so he was complaining to higher ups. And he didn't, but he was independently wealthy, so that's maybe why the churches he served didn't care to pay him. He also didn't care for his heirs, who were his brothers. So Livingston, having known this guy and known his situation, and was unhappy about his situation in his own situation in New Brunswick, and about how the church had appointed him to a job for which they didn't provide the money. The story goes this way. Livingston, seeing dollar signs in his old friend Van Bunschoten, wrote him a letter and said, "This is how you can stick it to both your heirs, who are your brothers, and to the church, who's not doing what you want the church to do. Give your money to the college." And so Van Bunschoten, I was told, did this. While the church's synod was meeting in September of 1813, he wasn't a delegate that year, but he knew where it was meeting because it was a public announced. He marched into the building carrying some saddlebags, walked up the center aisle of the church where the synod was being held, dumped the saddlebags on the table at the front, and declared that this was for the college. He gave $17,000. He died 2 years later, and the college got $17,000 in 1815. When Van Bunschoten died, he was buried in Sussex County. But the next year, in recognition of his great service to the church, the synod had him disinterred and reburied at First Reformed Church in New Brunswick. So his grave is just down the street from Old Queens. The second story says this: despite the lack of the injection of those funds and the faculty and the new building, undergraduate education was again suspended in 1816. And it didn't resume till 1825. So we have a 1793 to 1810 suspension, then an 1816 to 1825 suspension of Rutgers, the college. At the seminary, it's a point of pride, and pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, but even the seminary is not immune to sin. At the seminary, it's a point of pride that the theological institution kept the college on life support. Now, Rutgers Prep, across the street from Old Queens, continued on, and they probably have their own story that might be different from the theological institutions, but still the same story. The college failed, not totally failed, and we kept them going. The college reopened in 1826 and began to grow from there and has not looked back. The next story, let's see. On the church side, there was a deal, though. The college president would always be a clergyman. The trustees would be appointed by the church, and things were going fine, although there was grumbling because on the church side, they said, well, we appoint and pay these theological professors, but they have to give too much of their time to those pesky undergraduates. By 1840, the college had grown and was doing well enough that the seminary faculty no longer had to teach undergraduates. The two institutions, though, continued sharing the same set of buildings. Old Queens still housed the theological institution. They just had separate institutional lives. Next picture should be Colonel Henry.
We only have the title?
Okay, wait for him. Let's click him back and forth a couple times.
I see Old Queens again.
And now do you get Henry yet?
No, sir, not quite yet.
Let's go down a slide and back up.
Now, of course, I have a white background. Back to Old Queens.
Old Queen.
There we go.
Colonel Henry. Okay.
We love Colonel Henry.
We're going to go back to 1816. Henry Rutgers had served as a trustee of the college starting in 1816, but he'd only actually attended 2 annual meetings before he resigned in 1821. It was a troubled period in the college's history. There was conflict between the trustees and the church synod over governing the college, the curriculum of the college, how the college would be funded. Probably most of the conflict was about money. In 1816, undergraduate college was suspended again. Rutgers resigned in 1821, but he was still an active member of the church, and he served on various boards, and he was informed of what was going on. In 1822, he even had a meeting of his house because the church synod appointed a committee of correspondence between the synod and the trustees of the college to resolve the dispute over finances. At this time, Livingston, who was the professor of theology and the president of the college that was no longer operating, was facing retirement, and he actually retired in 1824. The superintendents of the theological institution appointed Philip Millidoler, the pastor of the collegiate church, again, the church with the money, as the professor of theology. Millidoler was Rutgers' pastor. And in deference to Rutgers' reputation in Lower Manhattan, there you see the map of the Rutgers farm, all laid out in houses. That's the East River to the south of it, the very tip of Manhattan down there. The source of the Rutgers money was breweries that they ran, and then the farm, and then real estate development. So Millidoler said, oh, Henry Rutgers, he's a very pious man, a very good man, and a very rich man. And so he made a motion at the synod in 1825, let's rename the college to honor this pious good man. And it passed unanimously. The synod passed it, the trustees passed it, and Millidoler became appointed then the president of Rutgers College. New Jersey's legislature chimed in soon after, and early in 1826, Colonel Henry gave $200 to purchase the bell that's in the cupola of Old Queens. And that bell is still there today. And a year later, he gave the college a bond of $5,000 to be held in trust for support of the college. Now here's the connection. Had Elias van Bunschoten made the same kind of deal with Livingston that Rutgers made with Millidoler, maybe the Scarlet Knights today would be marching out under a great big V as Van Bunschoten University. Next picture, there should be 3 on the screen.
We have 3 on the screen.
Okay, talking about undergraduate and theological education in the 19th century doesn't allow for a whole lot of different pictures. You get a lot of real estate and a lot of men. The story of Herzog Hall offers a slight breather, but also another caution. In the early 1850s, William Campbell was the professor of Hebrew and Aramaic at the seminary, teaching in Old Queens. One day he rallied his theological students together. He said, let's have a protest. Let's petition the Synod of the Church to find donors so the seminary can get out of this building. In 1855, Anna Herzog donated $30,000 to the seminary in memory of her husband, Peter, to fund the construction of Herzog Hall, which you see at the top right there, with the cows in front of it. That's just the other side of Seminary Place. The cows are about where the statue of William of Orange stands. That's how it looked in 1857. Anna Herzog gave this money, but the portrait that's up there is not Anna Herzog. I remembered that portrait hanging from the library gallery when I was a student at the seminary. And I thought, I put two and two together, and I asked the library to give me a copy of it for use today. And the best the librarian could do was find the one and only picture of a woman that was from that era that had been hanging in the library. And it's not Anna Herzog, it's Mary Board, and she's only identified as a donor. Now, I would suggest that some future American church history doctoral student make tracing down Anna Herzog and Mary Board one of their projects, and also finding the other women in the history of the university and the seminary, and get their pictures out there too. The land that the building went on between Seminary Place and Bishop Place and George Avenue and College Avenue was donated by a guy named James Nielsen and David Bishop, after whom Bishop Place is named. I always thought it was named after a bishop. It reached almost all the way to College Avenue, and the land at that time was valued at $14,000 in 1855-56. Other donations and purchases got the rest of the block all the way through to College Avenue. By 1857, Herzog Hall was built far away on Holy Hill. It was the seminary's home, but it wasn't owned by the seminary. The church created that as a separate corporation so that by overbuilding, they could provide dormitory, gymnasium, dining hall, and other kind of spaces at a profit to students who were at the literary institution, by that time named Rutgers College. Next picture. We should have William Campbell.
We do not quite yet.
Okay, we're going to go back and forth a few times.
I have the previous slide currently. Now I have Demarest.
Okay, now you got to go back to the previous slide and back to Campbell.
Perfect.
Okay, William Campbell was the the university's webpage, rutgers.edu, about our Revolutionary Roots history, is a marvelous page. It's great. The charter came in 1766. Certain people were very important in the Revolution, and then Colonel Henry Rutgers got it named after him. In 1864, we have a land-grant university. It misses all of this church connection stuff. I don't begrudge that. That's fine. Rutgers is a state university, and it doesn't have to say stuff about the church connection, but it is a bit of a hop, skip, and jump, and it misses something. And especially it misses the work of William Campbell, who actually moved the college to the land grant from being a private church-related college. It works this way. Campbell was the professor of Hebrew and Aramaic at the seminary in the 1850s, got Herzog Hall started on its way, and then in 1862, he was appointed the president of Rutgers College. So he went from seminary professor to Rutgers president. And at about that time, the Congress approved this whole land grant college and university system. And like many clergymen and college presidents, Campbell saw dollar signs. So he moved the university, the college, from Rutgers College, our church college in New Jersey, to the state University or State College of New Jersey. The General Synod of the church signed off on the papers with its blessing, which meant the college couldn't come back and ask for money. And then Campbell stayed on as president of Rutgers for 20 years, 1862 to 1882. He resigned because his eyesight was failing. But then he walked across town to Sedam Street in New Brunswick and started Sedam Street Reformed Church, which you see there. And I don't know the year of this ad in the Rutgers handbook for new students, but there was an ad welcoming Rutgers students to take part in the activities of the church across town on Sedam Street. So there was still this friendly connection. Now we go to Demarest. You got Demarest?
Yes, we do.
Okay, Demarest was even more so. Demarest was born up on the other side of the Hudson, way up by Albany, at Hudson, New York. But as a child, about 1867, the family moved to New Brunswick. When Demarest got old enough, he went to Rutgers Prep, or the grammar school it was called. Finished there in 1879, walked across the street to Rutgers College, and he was a really active guy. He was class secretary, vice president, president of his class, director and secretary of the Athletic Association, a member of the societies, and the class day orator. He graduated with high honors 1883, went back to Rutgers Prep for 2 years, then to the seminary, was ordained.
Looks as though we may have lost some connection to David, Dana.
Yeah, I was going to ask if that was happening to anybody else or if it was just my connection.
Yes, it seems as though his connection may have dropped.
Lived at Demarest House on the corner of
David,
George. Yeah.
We lost you for a minute there. Can you go back about 30 seconds maybe?
Okay. Demarest was Rutgers through and through. He became the president of the college in 1906. He was president for 18 years. And when he finished, he was living at the Demarest House, which you can find on George Avenue by Seminary Place there, behind the School of Education now. He lived there from the time he became president in 1806 until the time he died, or 1906 till he died in 1956. When he finished being president of Rutgers after 18 years, so about 1924, he just turned the other way when he went out his front door, and he was president of the seminary for 10 years. There again, good cooperation, no hassle about who was what, good faith on both sides. Next picture, I'll go really quickly now. We got Horace Underwood.
We'll have to go back and forth. I only have the title. Yes.
Okay. New Brunswick Seminary in the 19th century, like many American Protestant seminaries, was a hotbed of missionary activity. This guy, Horace Underwood, was he's considered a hero in Korea, where he was for 31 years in education work, founded Yonsei University, and did other church work. And then he fell ill. He returned to New Jersey. He died in Atlantic City, was buried in Union City. And about 25 years ago, the Koreans came and dug him up and moved the body to the Foreigner Cemetery in Seoul, where he is considered a hero to Korean Protestant Christians. I'm going to go quicker now. 1960s Zwemer Hall, you should have a picture.
We will go back and forth one more time. Currently still see Horace.
Back to Horace.
Yes.
Zwemer Hall. In the 1960s, Herzog Hall had been running for 100 years, and it was knocked down and replaced with this charmless building. The inverted peach basket that you see there was the chapel. And the building was charmless. And just general decline in Protestant Christianity in America was felt there at the seminary. It was becoming a commuter school. fewer and fewer students were able to live on campus. Married students housing was built, but there were more married students. People were coming later in life for ministerial training. When I lived on campus, there were probably a dozen apartments in the married students housing that were there. And there were 2 big old faculty houses that were for single people, maybe about 25 single students living on campus. And in 2012, Dr. Greg Mast, who was the president in 2012, once commented to me that around that time, he and his wife were the only people living on that entire block in the middle of the campus. At nighttime, theirs were the only lights that were on. Very quickly, now we have St. John's University in Queens. You have that?
Yes, sir. We do.
Okay. In the late 70s, under the direction of Dr. Howard Hageman, who was the president, the college moved over to do some programs across the Hudson, where it had begun. There had been a theological seminary in Manhattan. New York Theological Seminary had lost its accreditation for some reason. And so they continued training their students. Some New Brunswick faculty went over there once or twice a week to give a class here and there, and the degrees were granted by New Brunswick. Eventually, New York Seminary got their act back in order, but New Brunswick had already taken a bite of the Big Apple, so now has about half of its students go to school at St. John's University in Queens and never see New Brunswick until they come for graduation. Now we get to the part where the university returns the favor. We should have 2 buildings currently on the Rutgers campus. Back and forth.
We're going to have to go back and forward. I still see becoming a commuter school, now MBTS today.
University returns the favor.
Not quite yet. Maybe one more time. Not yet. It seems like it's slowing down on us, David. I apologize.
Okay, well, maybe there are too many pixels in these jobs. I'll say this. In 2015, Rutgers University and New Brunswick Development Company saw this big chunk of land with a needy institution on it right in the middle of campus. And so between Rutgers University, New Brunswick Development Company, and the seminary, a deal was made. The buildings of the seminary, with the exception of the library, were all knocked down. And on the corner of College and Seminary, in double quick time, a beautiful building was put up for the seminary to use. And at the other end of the block, the Honors College of Rutgers College went up, and in between them are 2 Rutgers academic buildings. Let's try the switch again. You got them now? No.
Unfortunately not.
And this was the time when the Rutgers University returned the favor to the seminary, because the seminary was basically having to spend too much of its resource maintaining its land and property and buildings. And the buildings were getting old. The 1960 building was already 40 years old. It was time for a lot of that stuff to go. Some of the buildings, like the one that I lived in when I was on campus there, was a 19th century building. There was too much to maintain. So the university returned the favor, and the seminary was able not only to have a new building, but also put $18 million in its account. The university got the rest of that block of really good property that cost $14,000 back in 1856. Today, now have we got President Holloway?
Yes, sir.
President Holloway on the right, 2020, the first African-American president of Rutgers University. President Micah McCreary of New Brunswick Seminary, 2017, the first African-American president of New Brunswick Seminary. He's not a member of the Reformed Church, he's a Baptist, and most of his students come from the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So that chugs along. Let's see, I have 2 more slides if we can get them. No, 1 more slide. That should be that's the faculty of New Brunswick Seminary today. They should
Just want to go back and forth one time.
Back and forth. Back and forth. Too many pixels. Up and down.
We're still on Holloway.
Okay, well, let's go back to Holloway and back down again.
Perfect.
Okay, so you look at the faculty of the New Brunswick Theological Seminary today, you see 2 Koreans, a number of African Americans, and a large contingent of women, and a large number of African American people and a few white guys. Yeah. There's still cooperation, and this goes back, it's using the Van Bunschoten money that was given in 1813. 3 undergraduate fellowships are available to Rutgers undergraduates today, and they work half-time with Rutgers faculty and half-time with Dr. Brum, Reverend Brum, who you see with the suspenders at one end of the faculty there. One works in areas of racial justice, one works in restorative justice from violence, and one works in interfaith relations, and they spend half of they're involved in internship service and then certain amount of time every week with faculty members, half at Rutgers and half at the seminary. This is still paid for out of the Van Bunschoten money. So maybe the whole Rutgers Scarlet Knights won't march out under a Scarlet V, but these 3 undergraduates every year will. Thank you very much for your time, and let's go to taking questions. I'll get out of my slides. And back to whatever we have. Stop
Thank
share.
you, David.
My pleasure.
So we don't have any questions yet. So if people want to use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, if you have any questions or would like David to maybe talk about something a little bit more that you found interesting. While we wait for questions, any anecdotes from your time at Rutgers? I always like to ask alums about a story or something from their time on campus.
My time on campus would include my time in the seminary when I lived the second house in from George Avenue on Seminary Place, one of those great big old houses. And it was Labor Day in 1979. And I woke up and I looked out the window and undergrads were on campus. And I looked out and I said, who let all of these children into Rutgers? I was all of 27 years old and they were probably all of 18 years old. But already then I was an old fogey. That's the first anecdote. When I was at the School of Education, I was living in Jersey City, so I commuted a lot. And I remember the smell of the brakes on the train in the New Brunswick station. I had some excellent professors at the School of Education and over at the Labor Center on the other side of Cook College, and rode the bus a lot back and forth.
Great. We have our first question from Joseph, who asked if you could answer, what is the history of the Gardner Library? He studied there as an undergraduate when he lived in Ford Hall.
Okay, it's the Sage Library, Gardner Sage. Gardner was the guy's first name, and that was part of this whole Herzog Hall and building up of the campus from College Avenue all the way to George Street, or is it George Street or George Avenue? Anyway, that was one of the buildings that followed Herzog Hall and the movement of the seminary up there. The library had apparently been in the upper stories of Kirkpatrick Chapel, and it took a negotiation to get the theologians out from the literary books in the college library. And the library is so astonishingly beautiful, and it was built so it didn't require lighting at night. That's why all the windows are up high to let in the evening light. So let me see, it's been rebuilt and redone twice since I was there in 1979 and 80, adding on, they put the entrance at the other end, they've built new entrances to the basement, they just moved everything around, so I can't find anything in there anymore. But that goes back to that 1857 move out of Old Queens up to Holy Hill.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is from Barbara. Do you have any background on the Kirkpatrick Chapel?
Nope, because that was the college itself. And with a name like Kirkpatrick, hey, that ain't Dutch. Of course, with a name like Alexander, neither am I.
Okay, a follow-up question. Who was Gardner Sage? Was he a donor?
I have no idea, but probably because that's whose names get on buildings. He wasn't the president of the seminary. That's whose names got on the buildings up and down Rutgers on the central campus there, his old presidents. So Sage must have been a donor. Herzog Hall was a donor. Sudam Hall on the other side of of Herzog Hall from Gardner Sage Library, that went down in the 1960s too. Sudam was a donor. These are named after people who gave money.
Even back then, huh?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
All right. We have a comment. James just said that this lecture was he really enjoyed it. It was full of rich information. And he also said Sage was a donor as far as he knows. So
Okay.
we'll go with that. Any other questions? We have a few minutes left. There's a hand raised. Herman, let me see if I'm going to try to unmute you if you want to ask your question that way. Let me try to do that. Okay, you can unmute yourself and ask the question if you'd like.
I just wanted to say that the campus in the 1950s and 60s was exactly the way it was in the 1860s. It hadn't changed for a whole century.
Mm-hmm. And where did you live on campus, sir?
I lived in Abraham's Bosom, which was the highest point in Herzog Hall.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Okay, we don't have any more questions right now. I will say I do know there was there was a building that they wanted to knock down and put up a new one. It never happened, but they were being very specific to keep the look of sort of the old Rutgers buildings, to keep that integrity on campus. I know some of the buildings are, if you've been on campus lately, look very different, but on College Ave specifically, there was a building that if we knocked it down, I believe it was New Jersey Hall. If it was going to be knocked down, it was going to need to be put up with something that had the old aesthetic, so to speak.
Because New Jersey Hall doesn't necessarily have that, right? It kind of looks like it's 1950s industrial. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Question. I'm going to kind of read it as I go. From Milton. During my time at the New Brunswick Theological Seminary, the producers of the movie IQ about Albert Einstein wanted to film a scene at Gardner Stage Library. The librarian at the time turned them down. Have there been any requests from Hollywood producers or whomever to film there since? Do you know of any?
I don't know.
Yeah. It's interesting. Some campuses get very protective over filming on them.
Milton, by the way, is the guy who told me the story about his daughter that I started the whole thing with.
Oh, how about that? It comes full circle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see. Another question. Was the sorority building on the corner of Bishop Place and College Ave affiliated with the original theological seminary?
Okay, is that building, I don't believe, when that block was acquired by the seminary in 1855, let's say, they got from George Avenue all the way towards College Avenue minus 166 feet. And then Bishop, who gave some of the land along College Avenue, and I think Nielsen gave another lot, and they had to purchase another lot, but they may not have got them all. That corner may have been unsold to the seminary. It wasn't part of the seminary when I was there. The house next to it was.
All right, we're at 12:54, so we're almost done. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for sharing your time, your studies, your sort of passion with us. It is greatly appreciated. We had quite a few people in the comments say that they really enjoyed this, so thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a good feeling.
Oh, we have one more question from Phil. You mentioned a statue of William of Orange. I assume this is the statue I know of as Willie the Silent.
That's right.
Share any information about this statue?
It's all on the plinth. And what I remember from the plinth is the last line of the poem. And when he died, the little children cried. And I can only hope to aspire to that.
That I did not know that had a different name, since now it's just Willie the Silent on campus. So learn something new every one of these talks. Someone saying the building at the corner of Bishop and College is and was the, oh my gosh, I'm so bad at these. Chi Phi fraternity, CHI, PHI. I wasn't in a fraternity or sorority. I'm bad at these letters. And someone else, Joseph, was saying that the statue was donated by the Holland Society of New York in the 1920s.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's on the plinth too.
Wow.
So who says always read the plaque? Well, read the plinth.
All right. Well, I think that is it for the questions. I appreciate everyone. This was a great conversation. I appreciate everyone who joined us. I appreciate David. Again, this was recorded, so if there's somebody that you would like to share this video with, we'll send you the recording later today along with a survey. We always like to get information and feedback, and we're always looking for speakers for future events. Our next Scarlet speaker is with another alum, and the title of the talk is The Future of Commerce, Exploring E-Commerce and Looking Ahead. So that is in, I believe, 2 weeks. But as always, the School of Arts and Sciences website, there's an events tab. That's where we list everything that we have coming up and what's on schedule. Additionally, we're going to send out something. Homecoming weekend is coming up the first weekend in October. So I don't know how many people are local or want to come, but there are going to be a lot of school-sponsored tailgates that day.
Okay.
All right, David, thank you so much. It was so great meeting you. I hope we'll be able to cross paths on campus when you're out in New Jersey doing research.
I'll be there the first week of November. Okay.
We'll look for you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
so much.
everyone.
Bye-bye.